So I want to give you some general tips for writing in this class. And I think they're general enough that they'll help you in just about any humanities course. I'm interested here in substance, form, and process, okay? And that's what I want to see in everything you write, whether it's 2 paragraphs in a forum assignment or 2 or 3 paragraphs in a test. You really shouldn't have to write anything much longer than that. Most of your exam answers are a paragraph or 2. Most of your form answers should be about 2 paragraphs. Your responses, a paragraph. So we're not dealing with papers now, but some of what I'm telling you can actually be applied in other classes like 5-paragraph essays, 5-page essays, 10-page papers. The basics here can really help you communicate better, because the key point of this class is critical thinking and analysis, and dealing with issues that are difficult and don't lend themselves to easy yes, no, true, false, A, B, C, D answers. Right, so that's what we want to get at with this, without getting too difficult, because it is a 100 level class. So what do I mean by substance, right? Number one, I give sometimes kind of word counts, but I hate doing that. It's just kind of a general guideline. More important than counting words is making your words count, okay? You want to avoid fluff. I think most of us know what that means. Don't pad your papers. Don't tell me a lot of stuff that doesn't apply, that doesn't matter. People often put in sentences that mean practically nothing. Okay. Also, don't start throwing around terms when you don't even know what they mean. Make sure you know what a term means. And in fact, a good idea that will help you both with the word count and words that count is taking the time to define terms in your own words, because it makes your paper longer, or your essay, your paragraph, whatever, a little bit longer, and it shows whoever's reading that you, especially on a test or a forum, that you know what you're talking about. It clarifies things, right? So philosophy, literature, religion, like this class, right? I want to make sure you understand a term. In the last little bit, we'll talk a very little bit about fundamentalism in religion, and one of the words I use is monosemic. We won't get into what that means now, but I've had in the past so many people just throw that word out, like, oh, you said this word, so I'm going to say this word, and they obviously had no clue what it meant. That's not helpful. So if you can't define it in your own terms, it means you don't know what it means. So you need to go back and kind of think through it. And if you can't understand it from the material that's there, email me, ask me a question. Look for more definitions somewhere else. Make sure you can put a definition in your own words, okay? And define your terms. That's a great way to make your words count and kind of expand the length of something that's technical like this, right? I realize that I know what the word means because I'm giving it to you in the class, but I need to see that you know what it means and that you can use it effectively and you can apply it to a broader discussion. So that's a key point, are those types of things, right? Don't just ramble on and on. Stick to the main idea. Don't try to pad your paper with meaningless gibberish and babble. Know what terms mean when you use them. Be sure to answer the question. This may seem like a silly thing to say, but I cannot tell you how many students get low and poor grades because they simply do not answer the question. I've asked questions about what we discuss about what a religion says about something, and somebody will ramble on for 2 paragraphs about their own opinions and how they feel about something that's not really related to the question, doesn't address any of the issues we talked about in class, and really is just quite a rambling. I've also had people like try to research a couple of terms instead of looking. My questions are generally directed at trying to get you to look at the information from the course material. But it never fails that someone takes one term out of the question, goes Googles that term, tries to find things, reads things that they don't understand, and tries to put it in an essay. And it has nothing to do with the question I asked, nothing to do with what we discussed in the class. It misses the point entirely. I'm here to teach. An online humanities course is challenging. It's got difficulties. One of those difficulties is I can't look around and see cluelessness on your face if I lose you, which I do in a class setting frequently. I'll backtrack if I see it looks like somebody just doesn't understand. You can't raise your hand and say, I don't understand what you mean with that, right? So you need to make sure if you don't understand me in class materials that you take time to send me an email, ask me a question. Make sure you understand the material, and then when you get a question on a test, I'm not going to give you an answer to a test question, but if you don't understand the question, when you look at the test, your exams are not, nor are your forms, something that you log into, you're timed, and you just have a limited time. Your exams and your forms are assignments that you get in advance. You have days to complete. Read through those questions. Make sure you understand them early on. If you open it for the first time 2 hours before it's due and you don't understand the questions, there's a good chance you're not going to reach me. To clarify, I'd be glad to clarify. That's why I post these things as early as I can in advance of their due date, because I want you to have several days to look over it and make sure you understand the questions. So please be sure to answer questions. It's one of the biggest mistakes I get in a 100 level class. People just start rambling about one point and they don't address anything from the class and they don't really address the question. Avoid simplistic answers. This is especially in the forums, but it can be in the test too. And this can really have to do with, in the forums, just for example, you're responding, maybe somebody else says something and you're supposed to respond. And you say, yeah, I agree with you. Okay, that's nice. But on what? What point? In what way? Or no, I think you're wrong. How? Why? What aspect? Right? You may get a question about their professor said this. Do you agree or disagree? I'm perfectly happy if you disagree with me, if you support it. Give me something to discuss with you. Also, think about this. I want to talk about simplistic answers. You want to think about, again, I mentioned know what terms mean and defining terms. This can take place in a different way as well. When you get let's say, I don't think you'll have this, though it may apply to one of the form exercises. Your understanding, maybe your previous understanding of, I'll ask a form question, what was your previous understanding and experience of Christianity, and how does the Jewish aspects of Christianity that you're going to learn about, what do you think about that? How does that impact your thoughts on Christianity, its history, its current manifestations? If you start out by saying well, I'm Catholic, and you go on from there without saying anything about what you mean by that, right? What's your narrative? You have that what's your narrative question, right? Let's say I was to answer the question, I was to do the what's your narrative and say, well, I'm an evangelical Christian. Well, what does that mean? I rarely use that term. Some people would say I am one, but now what does that mean? If I just give you that label, it doesn't tell you much about my narrative because you've got a label. And you may define that label as somebody who voted for Trump, which is not actually who I am. You may define that as somebody who is backwards and silly and doesn't like science. You may define that as, you could define that as the reader in 100 different ways. I'm not giving you any information. I'm giving you a label. So the same could be true of I'm Buddhist, right? What do you mean? My narrative. Well, I'm a Buddhist. Are you? I mean, what kind? Are you Zen Buddhist? Are you Theravada Buddhist? Are you Buddhist in the sense of you're an American, you were born in a kind of moderately Christian home that celebrated Christmas and Easter, but you took martial arts with somebody who was actually into some forms of Buddhism, and you learned to meditate. And I mean, I've known somebody like that who was attended a church regularly, was a Christian in one sense, but they considered themselves a Buddhist as well because they took martial arts. But if he had just said, I'm a Buddhist, there's so many possibilities what he could mean by that. So, I'm asking for a narrative. What's your narrative? What does that mean? I'm an atheist. In what sense? Like you're just diehard convinced that there's no God, and you're out to convince everybody else, like, a Richard Dawkins or a Dennett, or like, well, I don't particularly believe in a God, but hey, live and let live. I suppose I could be wrong. I mean, labels, you can use the labels, but you need to define them. Just to throw a label out there to say, a title for yourself like that is a simplistic answer. Define what you mean by things. Don't just label them, right? Don't just give me a bunch of labels. I went to church all my life. Okay, where? Did it matter to you? I mean, that's in your narrative. Let's say in a test question, if you're talking about, say, apophatic and cataphatic, and, apophatic is a way of negation. Cataphatic takes a positive approach. Okay, that's true. That's a good start. Did you get more than that out of it? What do you mean by a way of negation, right? That needs to be explained a little more. So that's what I mean, avoid, a lot of people think they've written a sentence or two and they've got it. Or they've written a sentence and then they've padded it with sentences that don't mean anything and they've got it. Because they have the basic answer and they have the basic word count. And that's what you have to avoid here. So like I said, none of this yes I agree or no, none of these labels, okay? Be careful about your assumptions. I've had on multiple occasions, not a lot, not in the sense that, oh, maybe I'm miscommunicating, where most students seem to understand what I'm saying. But I've had, from time to time, students say, I agree with what the professor says about X, or what the writer said about Y, and then they go on to say something that I didn't say, or the writer of the article didn't say. Neither of us said what they said. Somehow, from one little point, which they never make clear where they got it, they have some assumption about what I or what the writer of the article tends to believe or think or understand about something, and they've just assumed that their view of things is what we're saying. And they haven't even made it clear why. And oftentimes, I could point out several points where they're diametrically opposed to the person that they're complaining, they're saying that they agree with, right? That they're claiming they agree with. You have to be careful about the assumptions that you make. Also be careful about the assumptions of, there again, kind of those labels that when you give a label or a word, that it's clear what you mean by it. Make sure that you're clear when you get personal or technical. Don't assume things about the reader. Don't assume that I understand a vague answer. Give detail. Be concise, but be precise, right? So that's what I mean by substance. Here's some examples of like what not to do. right? Some of those mistakes that I mentioned. So I had a question. You'll probably get this question, maybe not. But so here's a preview on your. It's not on the Buddhism Hinduism test. Obviously, this is about the Abrahamic faiths. So in Exodus 3, we're going to talk about how we see things about the attributes of God from this story in Exodus. And we went over this in the lecture, you'll see it. But here's this passage, right? I give this passage. Moses is shepherding the sheep. He sees this burning bush. God calls out to him. He tells him, this is holy ground. I'm the God of your fathers. Moses hides his face. Here's this little bit of a story, right? We have this bit of a story that they read in class. I discussed it in one of the lectures. And the point is to explain what attributes of God from within the Abrahamic traditions you see within this passage, because we're talking about how the stories themselves inform what the traditions say doctrinally and what they do practically, how they practice worship, right? That those things are drawn from the stories, and the stories are often what's shared, even though there's oftentimes diversity within a religion. The stories are nonetheless shared, and there's similarities of practice and doctrine based on the shared stories. So, this was an answer someone gave. God was speaking to Moses from a burning tree, telling him to go to the Egyptians and free them, which is wrong, well, at least unclear, right? Telling him to go to the Egyptians and ask for the Hebrews to be freed. They were being held captive by Pharaoh as slaves, and God wanted Moses to go out and free them to a place where they are free to go anywhere. Moses didn't want God to see what he had become in the wilderness because he was ashamed. God was also letting Moses know he was the God of all people, including Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God was ready for Moses to take on a task. He's aware of the suffering that was going on because of the Egyptians. So we talked about some of the issues. What are some of the issues? Well, these circled sections basically are pretty much summations of the story that I gave as part of the question. So you've given no new information here. It hasn't actually answered the question, right? You've just summarized the story that you read. That's not an answer. That's a summary. And for that matter, it's not even a good or accurate summary, right? There's problems with it. Then there's one sentence that's possibly a summation. It's an interpretation, but I don't even know where they got it, right? Moses did not want God to see what he had become in the wilderness because he was ashamed. Okay, this is very vague. What had he become in the wilderness? Moses didn't want God to see he was a shepherd? Moses didn't want what? What is that talking about? Where do they get that from the story? What does that have to do with the idea of the attributes of God, which the question was, discuss attributes of God drawn from the story by Abrahamic faiths. So there's no answer really there. But you might be shocked to know how many answers I get of this form, where people simply rephrase what I've already put there, and then say one thing, maybe one or two things that don't really mean much of anything, or are inaccurate, okay? So don't do this. This is not the way to answer this question. It's not the way to answer any question. Make sure you're answering the question. Don't just summarize. Don't just paraphrase. Don't be vague, like that underlined yellow sentence there, okay? That's a problem. This is from a forum assignment in a different class. And I said there are these three people, two of them atheists from very different atheistic perspectives, and one of them a very fundamentalist Christian. And I argue that they all three, though having different perspectives, one a believer, two unbelievers, one of the unbelievers being more of a political libertarian social commentator and the other being a scientist, came from different perspectives, but in some sense they all read the Bible in the same way, and that we'll get into that when we talk about fundamentalism, but it's the idea of a monosemic reading, the way you read a text. And I spent a good bit of effort on explaining monosemic reading, how that affects the way we read the text, that even though you might come to different conclusions, that modern people frequently read a text from the same approach, not necessarily with the same perspective. But this one pretty much tells me nothing, right? Except the first sentence is, I agree with what the professor said. Okay, so that paraphrases what I've said, what I've claimed, and said I agree. That's kind of one of those generalizations. Okay, you agree, why? Ham read it as personal to him, but in a literal sense. Okay, what do you mean by personal? What do you mean by literal? There's some accuracy there, but it's vague. What do you mean by that? Because literal could mean a few things. Gillette read it like he was taught in church, but was not pleased with the outcome. What does that mean? Not pleased how? How was he taught in church? What does that have to do with the idea of being a similar way of reading to what Ham read, right? Sagan read it from a scientific point of view that had no backup. What does that mean? Is Sagan saying that the Bible has no scientific backup? Or is Sagan using a false scientific view that he can't actually back up himself? So there again, you've got this vagueness with no support, no clarity. And then that last sentence just sums up that the two were atheists and the one was not. And it's not even clear. Gillette did start out, it's actually the misspelling of the name, it's Penn Jillette, the comedian, social commentator, kind of popular libertarian. So, magician is Penn Jillette. He had been raised in a Christian home and became an atheist. Sagan, I don't know. We didn't say anything about a shift in Sagan. There was just an issue that we looked at with the way he talked about the Bible. Ham is a very fundamentalist, very strict, specific way of reading the Bible. But this answer doesn't, most of it is just paraphrasing what I said and then giving some vague points that really don't mean much of anything, right? Avoid that. So form, what do we mean by form? Okay, for this class, some classes, it's got to be MLA, it's got to be Chicago, it's got to be AMA. I'm not worried about that here. An upper level philosophy class, an upper level religion class, I might give more kind of specific, kind of subject specific instruction on form. But what I mean by form here is that you're following a basic structure, that you have a thesis statement, I'll get into what that means, that you support that statement, and you do so with clarity and precision. Okay, that's what I'm looking for. You do need to, when you quote, when you paraphrase, give some form of referencing it. Okay, you can, most of your material should come from class resources. So when it's coming from class resources, you can just mention the author or the title or the name of the lecture if it's from one of my lectures. You don't have to give me the full documentation on these tests and form assignments. We know what you're dealing with. Now, if you pull something from outside, I don't suggest doing that a lot, but if you do, if you feel like you must, be sure to give me a fuller documentation. Where it came from, publisher, website, whatever, who said it. But if it's, as long as you're using class materials, which you should be able to answer everything from the resources that you have in the course materials. A name, an author, maybe a page number if you quote and that has page numbers. If it doesn't have page numbers, I'm not too worried about it. But I'm not looking for, an MLA style bibliography or Chicago or, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm really looking that you have a solid structure to your paragraphs and your sentences, that they actually say things, that you actually support your arguments, that's actually clear and precise. That's what I mean when I'm talking about form. What of a thesis statement? Okay, so I pull this from an EasyBib guides. You see that web address there. You can find others. You Google how to write a good thesis statement. Purdue, OWL, there's University of Illinois, Indiana. A lot of schools have websites that describe a good thesis statement, how to write one. It's a single sentence that ties together the main idea of any argument. In the context of student essays, it's a statement that summarizes your topic and declares your position on it. The sentence can tell a reader whether your essay is something they want to read. I'm interested in that it gives the main idea, that it summarizes your topic and tells me your position. Okay, that's what I'm looking for. It's one sentence that does that, your topic sentence. It explains where you're going, the position you're taking. And it's really helpful to write this well, to take a little bit of time to write a good thesis statement for any paragraph, any 5-paragraph essay, any paper you write. When you have a good thesis statement, it actually keeps you focused and on task in what you're writing. Okay, and it's closely tied to the process, right? Because you want to connect your process to the goal of writing a good thesis statement and supporting that thesis statement. So you want to think through your main point and what would support that point, right? First, again, does this actually answer the question? When you think through your main point, look at your main point, put it down in a sentence, and say, does this address? One sentence is not going to fully answer the question on a test or in a forum, but does this open up and tell the direction of an answer to the question that was asked, right? And then kind of brainstorm and narrow down to the best points to form a basic outline, right? A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, right? Build your thesis on your outline. So think through, right? You get your main point and you think about a bunch of things that might support your main point, and then you narrow it down to like 3 of those. And then you kind of think through an outline. The 3 best of those is point A, point B, point C. Here's how I'd support point A. Here's how I'd support point B. Here's how I'd support point C. And make sure that sticks with the thesis and all of that goes to the question. Now I'm going to give you kind of a silly example of how to do this. Suppose I wanted to argue that chocolate cake is a good breakfast food, right? I know this is kind of silly, but just hopefully make it a little more fun. How would I do that? How would I write, my answer to, is chocolate cake a good breakfast? And I'm going to brainstorm, right? Well, I like chocolate cake. Breakfast is an important meal, and you're more likely to eat a meal if you actually like what you're eating, right? So your good ingredients in chocolate cake, especially if you use like whole wheat flour, raw sugar, real milk, good eggs, those are healthy. I mean, nobody would criticize me for eating eggs and toast and a cup of milk for breakfast. Why not chocolate cake? Cocoa's good for you. We can talk about that one as well, right? Then there are some problems, right? We're talking about sugar, we talk about fat, we talk about obesity. Okay, so it's got problems. It's not perfect. But that's, just an initial brainstorm, thinking through. Now, what are we going to do with that? Well, I like chocolate cake is not a really good reason, right? I'm going to write a paper, I like chocolate cake. Oh, well, some people like, getting plastered drunk every Friday night. It's really not good for you, whether you like it or not. I used to like to eat biscuits and gravy for breakfast a lot, and I gained a lot of weight in college because I ate it all too often. Okay, it wasn't good for me. So I like it doesn't make it a good breakfast food necessarily. So what might we do with it? Well, maybe there's something else we can say about the liking of chocolate cake. Why do I like chocolate cake? Well, say chocolate cake makes me happy. It may sound silly or less important, but think about this. There are studies about happiness. Happy people tend to live longer than people who are not happy. So there, instead of just saying I like chocolate cake, maybe chocolate cake makes me happy, and happiness is a good thing. It makes, you know, that's makes for a healthier life generally. Okay, so we can work with that. We're gonna work with that idea. This is going to be a short one, so maybe we don't want to talk about the problems. We just want to focus on our kind of three main supporting points of why it's a good breakfast. But I'm scratching that kind of partway through in yellow because maybe I could use that. If this is 5 paragraphs, you know, I could start with that's related, and maybe I could open my opening paragraph. You know, a lot of people would think chocolate cake is not good for you for breakfast because it has a lot of sugar, a lot of fat, there are problems with obesity. Go on with that. However, right, you get this transition. Then I'm going to give my answer. The rest of my essay is going to be based on this thesis statement. And what's the thesis statement going to say? It's going to take my 3 main points. Chocolate cake is a healthy alternative for breakfast because it promotes general happiness, encourages healthy habits, contains nutritious ingredients. Right? Now I have the basis for a paragraph or the basis for 5 paragraphs. Right there in one sentence, what I mean. Well, I've got the support. Promotes general happiness. What about chocolate cake? Promotes general happiness. Why does that make it healthy? Right? Maybe some things about how the correlation of happiness to general health. You know, happy people live longer. Happy people are more active. Whatever. I mean, you know, there's studies out there for these types of things. So I've got my first point. If I find some support for that point, that gives me a little bit of substance, right? Encourages healthy habits. You know, we can talk about breakfast is the most important meal of the day, right? So that's the next part. Maybe it's just a sentence, or maybe in a 5-paragraph essay, it's a paragraph. So we're going to argue that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But for sake of argument here, it will be. We'll give the support for that. We'll give the argument for that. And that's another part of our essay. There again, it's set up by our thesis statement. Contains nutritious ingredients. There again, that one speaks for itself. You give the details. Eggs, what's nutritious about eggs? Milk, what's good about that? What's good about using whole wheat flour to make your chocolate cake? And you have your essay. And it's all set up by this one little sentence that you took the time to think through and say, how am I going to address this issue? And I'm going to write that one sentence gives your main point, your position. Chocolate cake is healthy, and it introduces the way you're going to support that claim, right, with your 3 main supporting points, right there in one sentence. That's a thesis statement. And it's a silly example, but you can do this with discussions on religion. You can do this with discussions on your perspective on things. You can do this with discussions of your narrative. What's my life narrative? Okay, what's at the core of it? And what are 3 things that grow out of that, right? You'll have a question at some point about the incarnation and how that affects doctrine and practice within Christianity. So, the incarnation, which is XYZ, is central to the Christian faith and actually is seen to be so in the doctrines of in doctrines and practices, right? And then what doctrines? Doctrine A, doctrine B, doctrine C are connected to the incarnation because of this, this, and this, right? The practices within Christianity of this and this are connected to the idea of incarnation because, right? So you want to summarize. You don't have to give a lot of information in the thesis. Just set up what you're going to talk about. That's what a thesis statement does, whether you're talking about chocolate cakes or Christian doctrine or differences in Buddhist schools of thought. Okay, the same process, the same form, the same structure can really help you write a decent, solid answer that makes sense and contains good information and actually answers the question. So that's how we're going to apply this, right? This applies to your form exercises and your tests. Take time to think it through and create a good thesis statement, and it'll make the whole writing process easier. It'll help you not panic about the question. It'll help you know what information you need to focus on and what information you can throw out. Because you're writing a paragraph or 2 paragraphs or in some other place 5 paragraphs, you can't cover everything, which is a mistake a lot of people try to make, is they try to throw everything into the paper and end up saying nothing. You don't want to do that. Take the time, think through, create a thesis statement, and the whole process is easier. Finally, just in my writing tips, plagiarism. I found, especially in online classes, that plagiarism is worse than in class experiences, right? Because you get in this kind of cycle of, I'm looking at information on the computer screen, resources from the class. You ask me a question, I look at the resource, and I can kind of copy and paste an answer to the question out of the resource, like those discussion questions, right? If you do that on the discussion questions, that's pretty much fine, because what I'm getting at with those discussion questions is trying to point you to, this is an important thing in the reading, and also just trying to make sure, are you reading this through? Are you paying attention? Are you seeing the important parts? So, you know, when I ask a question that's almost straightforwardly, you know, a question about the Bhagavad Gita, and like there's a quote in the Bhagavad Gita that fits, yes, you can copy and paste that quote into that discussion question about the Bhagavad Gita, because what that shows me is what I wanted to see. Did you read? Were you paying attention? Did you find the answers to this question? But when it comes to your form exercises and your tests, oftentimes you're looking at everything on this computer screen. You're cutting back and forth. You got this question here. You got this information over here. And then suddenly I ask you an analytical question in a forum or on a test. And in the material that I gave you, there's not a straightforward answer that you can just cut and paste out. I did that on purpose, right? So your temptation is to go to Google and Google some terms and find somebody else's answer and try to paste it in. Usually it doesn't actually answer the question, not correctly or adequately or in the right direction or from what we've discussed in class, right? It doesn't have to do with our discussion. It's maybe some side note that you found, right? It's also usually clear to me that you've done that, even if you're close to being on the source matter, right? Even if you're close to addressing the questions I'm actually asking by cutting and pasting out of Google, usually I can tell, and often I can tell well enough to quickly, within about 5 minutes, Google myself in reverse and find where you cut and paste from. Don't do that in the forums and in the tests. Use the materials from class and form an answer, form a point of discussion, form an argument. You create a thesis statement, okay? If you do quote a source, like I've said before, if it's a classroom source, you don't have to do full documentation. I'm not looking for an MLA style paper of documentation, you know, for your test answers or your form exercises. But if you do, you know, so if you paraphrase or quote from source material, just mention the author, mention the title. If it has a page number, give me the page number. Because you may see something that I didn't even see, right? It's possible. I've read this material again and again and again, but I often find I've read something over and over and I missed a point, right? That happens to all of us. So if it's class materials that you're paraphrasing and quoting, just note which one. Lewontin, you know, he's not going to have page numbers because it's a web page. Bhagavad Gita, page, whatever, or section, whatever, right? You get into the Bible, you know, Luke chapter this, verse whatever, or the Quran. The Quran, Surah 3, down in verse, you know, whatever. If you're quoting those things, it's fine from class. You don't have to give me the full documentation. I know where you found it. If you spend the time, which I think is going to be a waste of your time, Googling for some other source on one of these questions, do give me the full source, right? Where did you find it? What did it say? Because otherwise it's plagiarism, number one. Number two, I'm going to figure out that you did that, and I don't suggest doing that because there's a good chance that you're going to find information that just confuses you more. You're better off trying to understand the question. If you don't understand it, email me with a question and let me clarify it for you, right? What I'm looking for is your thoughts on the question that I ask. Not just your feelings, not I have this opinion and this makes me feel good, or I don't feel so good about that, or I think that's a problem because it offends me, or well, I agree with that because that's how I grew up, or I mean, okay, I want your thoughts, like structurally, based on a thesis statement, giving me a real argument with real substance and support. How did you understand the material? How do you understand the material applying to this question? Of the terms that we use, which of those terms are important to this discussion, and how do you understand them in your words? That's what I'm looking for. So I'm going to know if you Googled it. I'm going to know if you copied it offline. Don't do that.